go. Um, so I'm one of the senior guest programmers of the festival. I helped select and work with the staff to come up with some of the films in this year's program, including this one. I'm a big fan of Robert Drew, the filmmaker. This is a film from 1963, of course, and we have a second film of his in this year's festival. If you haven't already figured that one out, it's Primary, which is about the Democratic primary election between Humphrey and Kennedy. And that's 1:30 here on Sunday. So if you haven't already, if you like this, at the end of this, and you want to go see that, get a ticket. I also want to give a shout out and a thanks to Janus Films, the distributor, for letting us have this film. It's a really wonderful package. They are actually the distributors of both films, which is really nice. I'm going to say a few words just about the film, kind of its role or its place in the sort of world of documentaries, and then I'm going to turn over to Aniko to talk a little bit more about sort of what the subject matter of the film. We're not, as we said, we're not going to do a Q&A afterwards because I think we can just kind of set it up for you, and then you can bug us if you see us around the festival and ask us questions then. So the basic plot of the film is obviously it's about it's a first-hand account of the immigration crisis in June 1963, and it includes interviews by George Wallace, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and in very unique circumstances, which I'll let Aniko talk more about. They used 5 different film crews to shoot this, sort of simultaneously, and had unprecedented access to capture firsthand what was going on, the conversations and the decisions behind the integration schoolhouse crisis. It's unique. It's very unique, and it's not something that we've seen before or since, this kind of a film. The film aired on ABC in October 1963, 4 months after it was shot. So it was a very contemporary film when it was aired. It's 52 minutes long, which is interesting as well, at least to nerds like me, because that was the sort of standard TV hour in the 1960s. They'd have about 8 minutes of commercials. Nowadays, you would have more than that. It would be more like 18 or 19 minutes of commercials in an hour program. So that's why when you look at some of these older documentaries, you see the length is kind of an interesting length that we're not really used to today. The film was selected for the National Film Registry in 2011, which means the country and the Library of Congress have decided that this is one of the landmark films that we really need to preserve and protect and make sure generations are aware of and have access to. And the Academy Film Archive made a point to restore the film, invest money in restoring the film just a few years back. It was 1999, 20 years ago. So this is a film that, you know, film historians, the government, everybody involved has said this is an artifact, this is a piece of cinematic history and of American history. And we want to make sure that this is something that everybody has access to. I want to talk about Drew for just a second. Robert Drew, the filmmaker, you know, you can go Wikipedia him and find out about his background, but he had a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard and was really interested in finding a new way to present documentaries. He thought documentaries were so boring at the time, and a lot of them were. You know, today when you look at the Academy Awards and you see the films that are nominated for documentary awards, particularly documentary shorts, there's some really interesting subjects. Back then, it was government-sponsored films that were the, you know, films that would be presented for awards. You know, about this military group or this battle or this thing. It was a pretty dry era for documentaries, and he was really tired of it. And he wanted to find a way to get at the truth, stop the artifice of, you know, making a movie in front of real people. He wanted to really find a new style to capture the truth. So he's considered one of the pioneers of what we call cinema verite, or film truth, cinema truth. Or direct cinema, it's also called observational cinema. This is a film, and this is a great example of it, as is Primary that we're showing on Sunday. He had some really phenomenal collaborators on this film, including D.A. Pennebaker, who went on to make, with his wife Chris Hedges, The War Room, and Ricky Leacock, who was also really well known for a film named Omnibus at 1 p.m. What I'm getting at is this film, this moment, this movement of film sort of marked the beginning of a new era of documentary filmmaking. This is one of the first examples of it. This preceded Primary, so this is considered one of the very first. And it led to, down the line, generations of filmmakers sort of understanding that cinema verite was a style that you could use in making films. And what is cinema verite? It's sort of denoted mostly, but the hallmarks are handheld cameras, it's fly on the wall, observational, it's meant to be as least intrusive as possible in the moment. So you want a single person, hopefully with a camera kind of tucked in the corner, recording the moment. You don't have a big camera crew with lots of lights and sound equipment, and a big crew imposing, really obstructing in the moment, and people being really aware that they're on camera. You ultimately would hope that you would get to a point where nobody's even aware the camera is filming. That's what he hoped to achieve. And no narration. It was really meant to be minimal and just let's get at the truth is what the idea was. In addition to them, there's some other really notable verite filmmakers I wanted to mention that some of you will have heard of, just in case you're interested in taking this further, being a nerd like me. Again, there's films like the Maysles brothers, who made Gimme Shelter and Grey Gardens. They're also considered, key filmmakers in this sort of a style. You've also got people like Frederick Weissman. He's still alive and cranking out 1 to 2 films a year as a fly-on-the-wall filmmaker. Chris Marker, he did Sans Soleil. Even Barbara Koppel, who did Harlan County, USA, a famous film about workers' rights and unions. All these are folks who are really known for their verite documentary filmmaking. But it's interesting because my opinion is that cinema verite has evolved. It was a movement, let's say, but I think it has really become more known as a style of filmmaking. So when you're a documentary filmmaker and you're looking to make a new film, you consider the ways you're going to shoot your subjects, you're going to present your subjects. And some people will say, let's do it in cinema verite. Let's do it in this style of handheld, run and gun, fly on the wall. And you've even seen it mocked, and you've even seen it presented in some of our contemporary culture, things like The Office, Parks and Recreation, Modern Family, This is Spinal Tap. These are all films that were using the style of cinema verite to present a story. And I think if this is cinema verite, if what you see is cinema verite, which is the absence of the filmmaker really in imposing their perspective and their presence, then I think you could say the opposite of cinema verite would be films by people like Nick Broomfield, Michael Moore, and Morgan Spurlock, people who insert themselves, their perspectives, and their personalities are driving the story. I think that's the sort of diametric opposite of what you're about to see. And then the last thing I'll say about cinema verite is that it's interesting because the movement, or the style, so to speak, was really intended to remove the filmmaker from the equation as much as possible and let the subjects be the ones who are speaking. But it's a film, and the filmmaker then goes into an editing room and selects the pieces and the moments and the order and the style in which these things are going to go together. So I think you can really argue that it's an aesthetic, it's an approach, it's a movement, it's a style, fine. But does it really remove the filmmaker from the equation? I would argue not. But it's meant to give you as close to reality as it can. This is a great example. It's a great film. It's a great historical document. I'm really excited to have you guys here to watch it. I'm going to turn it out to Aniko to talk a little bit more about the film's subject.
Hi. This is a film I teach every year in a class that I teach at UVA on media in the Kennedy era. So I taught this film just about a month ago. And so we talk about it as a documentary, as a film, but I think it's important to remember this was television. And JFK is typically considered the first television president. So the fact that we have both this film, the primary, it's kind of not, it's not an accident that we have these television documentaries featuring John F. Kennedy. Part of what you'll see in this film is, you actually won't see that much JFK. But when you do see him, he is, quite commanding. JFK, unlike any president before him, including Eisenhower, including Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon thought he was the first television president, because he did this speech in 1952 called the Checkers speech that saved his position on Eisenhower's ticket. Kennedy is the first president who really understood how to use this medium. And a film like this one shows you in some ways why. He is fully comfortable with a camera crew in his Oval Office. But it's not just JFK. It's also Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, is the Attorney General. And yes, that is totally nepotism. Robert Kennedy, as you'll see in the film, is actually more the star of this film than his brother is. The camera crews had much more access to Robert Kennedy and his Justice Department and Justice Department officials, particularly Robert Kennedy's assistant, Nicholas Katzenbach. And it's really quite remarkable, the portrait we get of Robert Kennedy in this film. What I often will tell my students when I'm setting this up for them, rather than for you, is that before this film aired, most Americans, when they would think of Robert Kennedy, the adjective that would typically come to mind was ruthless. Ruthless Bobby. Before becoming Attorney General, Robert Kennedy had run his brother's presidential campaign. What you will see in this film is the beginnings of Robert Kennedy's transformation from ruthless Bobby to Saint Bobby. By the end of his career, as many of you know, he ran for president in 1968, and like his brother, gets assassinated. And that this issue of cinema verite, this idea of cinema truth, the filmmakers not being present in the film, there is clearly a shaping going on here, and I think it's particularly around the way that Bobby Kennedy is presented here. So in the opening sequences that you'll see, you will see a juxtaposing of a family scene at Robert Kennedy's house in McLean, Virginia, with his ever-expanding family. He ended up, I believe, with 11 children by the time he was assassinated. That is juxtaposed with a family scene in Governor George Wallace's house in Montgomery, Alabama. And of course what you're seeing is true, but in the juxtaposing of our introduction to Governor Wallace and our introduction to Bobby Kennedy, I think you'll notice a clear shaping of how Robert Drew and his camera crew are encouraging viewers to make sense of and understand these two protagonists who, as you'll see in the film, are clearly opposed to each other. What else can I say about this film?
George Wallace.
Oh, yes. So, George Wallace, of course, this is all in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. JFK and Robert Drew had wanted to do a film that would help to document JFK and the White House dealing with a major crisis, a major presidential decision-making moment, and it just happened to be in the midst of this this particular civil rights era crisis, which was about the integration of the University of Alabama. This is 1 year after the crisis around the integration of the University of Mississippi, which descended into awful riots, 2 people killed, numerous people injured. The Kennedy administration did not want to see that happen again. And it's unclear to me exactly why George Wallace agreed to be in this film. Because it's clear the Kennedys felt they were on the right side of history, and of course, they were. The Kennedys also knew how to operate in this new media environment. So, this is a cinema verite film, they don't acknowledge the camera. It's like the camera crew isn't there. George Wallace is in a completely different film. He acknowledges the camera, he acknowledges the camera crew, he acknowledges them as Northerners. And you'll see that when he is taking the crew around the governor's mansion. I can only imagine that Wallace was, because he knew that this would be on, network national television, can only assume that he was really only interested in speaking to other Southern white segregationists, and basically indicating and showing by standing in the schoolhouse door that he was their champion.
Speaking to his face, like nobody else would have any. Well, we had to acknowledge it.